I'm here today to talk about rendering. Not the kind that the computer does with pixels, but the kind that you do yourself, with these guys. I have a long history with Blender. I've been using it for most of my life. But for the last 15 years or so, my primary creative projects have been in traditional media. Images like the one above are rendered almost entirely with ink on paper, usually with some very minimal digital touch-up after the fact. My process for the most part looks much like that of cartoonists from a century ago. But here's the secret. It's still Blender doing a lot of the heavy lifting. For years now, I've used it to construct what I refer to as study models, essentially a digital version of the maquettes and miniatures that illustrators have used forever. So in this talk, I'm going to show you a few of the ways that I use these models, how to get from Blender to traditional media, and some general thoughts on how to make the best use of this technique. So, to begin, what is it good for? The first and most obvious application for Blender is perspective. Perspective is hard. I struggle with it every day, and I've literally written a book about it. In many situations, it's much easier to just throw together some quick models in Blender and let it figure out how lines converge. Do you want to try to figure out how to draw stairs going up a curved hallway in three-point perspective? I sure don't. But it's useful in situations where more conventional subjects are involved too, whether they're large, open outdoor spaces, or more intimate interior ones. It's even more useful if you want something more complicated than traditional linear perspective. A fisheye effect is a huge pain to work out by hand, but pretty easy to set up in Blender. I don't use 3D for all of my drawings, nor is it my only tool for perspective, but I've learned from experience that whenever I find myself really struggling with perspective, a quick trip to Blender can usually get me back on track. Another application of this method is in maintaining accuracy and continuity for complicated scenes or objects. Cars, for instance. Notoriously difficult and unforgiving objects to draw. One of the characters in my forthcoming graphic novel drives this 1970s gremlin, so I've been having to draw it a lot. A lot! A lot! So many times. But I don't need to worry about keeping it consistent, or getting the perspective right, because that's all on the model. And I didn't even need to make this model. There are so many free car models on the internet that you rarely need to make one from scratch. But of course sometimes you need to build complex models from scratch too, if you expect to be drawing, for instance, a massive Art Deco athletic center. Or a TV camera from 1985. And as you've already seen in a few of these images, it's also useful for figure drawing. I probably wouldn't use it for any really nuanced kind of figure study, but for just establishing basic anatomy in space it can be really useful. I've been using this very simple rigged model that I found online somewhere for a long time. It's not ideal, but it gets the job done. I've been wanting to make a better one, and the main reason that I haven't is that I don't want to rig it. So if anyone would like to collaborate on that, let me know. But as a side note, often the best way to get good figure drawing reference is to abandon your pride and be your own model. Light simulation. This is a feature that I rely on less often, since most of my artwork doesn't really involve nuanced or complex lighting situations, but it still comes in handy from time to time. The ability to place lights in space exactly as they would occur in reality is extremely useful, and something that would be significantly more difficult to accomplish using traditional miniatures. But light simulation comes in really handy when color comes into the equation. This is a sketch for a painting I did for the cover of a science fiction anthology. I had this concept for a rocky canyon illuminated by the blue light of a gas giant, with some sort of orange space flowers growing on the canyon floor. This sketch allowed me to get the gist of the idea down, but to paint it, I really needed to see something more substantial. So, naturally, time for another study model. It's very crude in terms of modeling and texturing, but I spent a lot of time tweaking the lighting to find the exact luminous quality I was imagining. And here's the finished painting. I didn't follow the rendering in all respects, but it was still a huge help in figuring out the subtle nuances of the lighting and color interaction. And if you compare the finished painting to the original sketch, you can definitely see how my understanding of the overall lighting was improved by having built the model first. I'm really glad I didn't paint it to look more like this. Finally, these models can be really useful for thinking about composition. Moving the components around, moving the camera around. Do I want this shot to go this way or this way? Is this a good shot? Is it better to pull back? Bring the camera down just a little bit maybe? Short lens or long lens? Long lens. So you can imagine, this can lead to a significant amount of time doing minute tweaks that may not matter very much, and that's something to guard against. But I think it's a good way to work out some significant compositional issues before the pencil hits the paper. Now that we've seen a few of the ways that these techniques can be applied, I want to talk a bit about how this works in practice, starting with some tips on how to optimize the Blender workflow for this purpose. First, model only what is necessary. When working on this kind of thing, it's easy to get absorbed by what you're doing, so it's a good idea to figure out in advance what you need to model and what you don't. The building on the left was an extremely detailed model that I built for a comic recently. I spent hours on this. Had I looked at my own script a bit more carefully, I might have noticed that it appears in only 2 panels, and in one of them it's about the size of a thumbnail. I didn't need to do all this. On the right, I was thinking more practically. The buildings behind the car never needed to appear again, so I just threw in some boxes to serve as a very basic perspective guide. Sometimes it's hard to know intuitively what you'll actually need and what you won't, so it's a good idea to look at your project very carefully before you start modeling and figure out what you can simplify or leave out entirely. Second, you must optimize for traceability. Some of you have probably noticed the use of freestyle in most of these images and the lack of shading. This is because most of these drawings are optimized for traceability over all other qualities. Unless you're in need of a sophisticated value study, the most important thing is that the contours of your objects be easy to see. Freestyle is a great help for this, and so I almost always use it. Likewise, I often use special materials that completely eliminate shading. So far, the best material node setup that I've found is this. Let me know if you'd like a copy of this material, and I'd be happy to share it with you. You can even go crazy and add a texture. But in any case, the objective is to end up with a really clear, clean line drawing because you need to be able to see what you're tracing. Modularize your sets. It's a good idea to build your models in many separate pieces, because you will find yourself needing to turn on or off various components to get the specific shots you need. This house interior has separate collections for each of its stories, and within those stories it's easy to hide and unhide specific parts like walls and ceilings. This is another area where it pays to plan ahead. Don't make all of your walls into a single object if you might need to hide one of them in order to pull the camera back. And on a related note, name your objects. Don't be like me. Especially once you've turned something off, it's much easier to find it again if it's not named plane.011 in the hierarchy. But let's say you've got your render, and you're ready to get it off the screen and onto the printed page. We all know how to use a printer, so I won't dwell on this, but I wanted to share a few small tips to make this process as smooth as possible. First, let's talk about how to match the size of your render to that of your physical artwork. You'll need to measure your artwork and set the pixel size accordingly, keeping in mind a specific pixel density. I usually render to 600 pixels per inch. Blender does not, as far as I know, have any means of setting the density for the images it exports. But it does have a useful trick that spares you from needing to calculate the appropriate dimensions yourself. You can actually type equations into the input fields here. So if you know you need an image that's 3.75 inches wide, you can type 3.75 star 600 into the input box, and the correct value will appear. Then, after saving your image, all you need to do is set the density appropriately in an image editor, and it will print out at the correct size. And for all you image magic heads out there, here's the command you want. Once you have your images, it's just a matter of dropping them onto a page template and sending them to the printer. I like to use Inkscape for this because I'm running an open source only production here, but Photoshop will also work in a pinch. And just like that, we've got our reference sheet and we're ready to go onto the drawing board. So how do the reference images ultimately get onto the working surface? Those of you with an art school background are probably familiar with this process already, but for everyone else, what you see here is the page on which I'm going to draw my final artwork, and taped beneath it is the reference render that I'll use as a guide. The surface beneath both of them is a light box. The light box is essentially an illuminated drawing surface that enables you to see through the paper well enough that you can trace the contours from the reference sheet. Even so, you'll notice that the visibility of the contours is not that good, especially where small details are concerned. That's why it was so important to optimize for tracing. Turning off the lights in the room makes the reference images easier to see. And to get a clear view of the artwork, just turn off the light box. While working, I usually cycle through the various lighting combinations frequently, depending on the needs of the moment. It's also very easy to peek at the original render by lifting up the paper, if the details aren't clear enough from the light box alone. It's a very flexible working method, allowing me to take full advantage of the reference renders without compromising my usual drawing process in any way. And just for fun, here's the finished pencil drawing for this page. I would show you the inked version, but the fact is I haven't inked it yet. You'll just have to check for it when the book comes out. But the light box isn't the only way to copy your reference renders. Another way involves this stuff, transfer paper. You should be able to find this at any decent art supply store, and if you're lucky it might even come in this amazing retro-looking packaging. It's basically the reverse of the light box method. Your drawing surface goes underneath, then the reference sheet goes on top with the transfer paper in between. You then trace the reference image, and the pressure of the pen causes the pigment of the transfer paper to stick to your working surface. This is a less versatile process than the lightbox method, but the advantage of it is that it allows you to transfer images onto surfaces that might not work with a lightbox, such as canvas or thick watercolor paper. And while this presentation is about traditional media first and foremost, I'd be remiss not to mention the 3D features of the popular drawing application Clip Studio Paint. Seen here are some images from the forthcoming book Sea Legs, written by Jules Bakes and illustrated by Nikki Smith. Nikki hired me to make this boat model, which she was then able to import and trace directly in Clip Studio Paint. I don't know a lot about this process, but it seems to work well for a lot of people who draw their work digitally. Now that we've discussed all the ways that this process is useful and the nuts and bolts of implementing it, I do think it's worth discussing a few things to keep in mind should you want to try doing this yourself. This process is very time-consuming, or at least it can be if you're not careful. This page comes from one of my earliest uses of this method, and I prepared renders for nearly every panel. Setting up these renders takes time that in many cases might be more productively spent working on the final art. To avoid spending excessive amounts of time tweaking things, it's important that you feel confident enough in your skills that you can accomplish the bulk of your artwork without Blender's help. That means you still need a solid art foundation. You must know perspective, composition, how to use your medium of choice. It is tempting to think that this is a magic bullet that will solve all of your artistic challenges for you, but it won't. It is a tool like any other, and the results you get out of it depend on your ability to make use of what it gives you. These images are from my undergraduate thesis, and while I used Blender to guide them, that didn't save them from being overall kind of smudgy and vague. The perspective may be accurate, but these aren't winning any art competitions. Finally, don't feel obligated to adhere to the render when it doesn't serve you. The render is not accurate to anything but itself, and in any event, accuracy is not your friend. So the key is, deviate. If the pose is too stiff, liven it up. If a line falls in an awkward place, move it. Leave out objects. Create objects that weren't originally there. Tracing is only good to a point. If you begin to treat the render as the final word in how your drawing should look, I guarantee that it will end up looking strangely stiff and lifeless. And specifically where comics are concerned, don't let yourself become devoted to the continuity of minor details. These images are all from a specific scene in my book, and from panel to panel the viewpoint changes, but it was important that readers always be able to see this TV camera in the background. So I just moved it around to make sure it stayed in the shot. In the fictional world of the comic, does it make sense for the camera to be moving around this much? Probably not. But the effect feels right, and I highly doubt anyone will notice. Continuity is only useful if it doesn't interfere with your ability to draw the things you need to draw. What it all comes down to is this. This method is all about your freedom, about enabling you as an artist to more easily draw the things that you might otherwise struggle with. The reference render is not your boss, it is your assistant. I've learned things about perspective, composition, and lighting from working with these reference renders, lessons that I've been able to reuse even when working without them. This process has been a great benefit to me as an artist, and it can help you too. If any of this has inspired you, I hope you'll take the time to slap together a quick model, print it out, and get drawing.